Wait. This is Jimmy Stewart. Philadelphia Street walk sign is on to cross Philadelphia.
Was that Jimmy Stewart I just heard?
This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, from Pittsburgh to Scranton and Philadelphia to Erie, it's Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, and today we're filming on location in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and we're filming at the Jimmy Stewart Museum. Today we want to examine the legacy of Jimmy Stewart, and we're fortunate enough to have the museum's president and executive director,
correct,
Janie
McCurden,
be our host today. Jamie, we're here right in front of the statue of Jimmy Stewart. What can you tell us about the statue?
Oh, well, it happened way before the museum did, where a group of people went to Stewart and said, we'd like to put a statue in your honor for your 75th birthday. So Stewart agreed. They worked with the sculptor, and Gloria had final approval on the likeness of the statue. And it was the last time actually Jimmy Stewart was here in town. So he came in town for his 75th birthday. They did a dedication of the statue, which is right here in front of our courthouse. It's a beautiful, beautiful bronze statue. We have the fiberglass version that was actually here for the dedication up in the theater. But it's a great representation. He's actually pointing across the street, which is where his father's hardware store used to be. And if you're really looking for a little nod, in the back on the base of the statue, a certain person named Harvey etched his name on the base. So you have to be a real detective to figure that out.
Maybe we'll find out who Harvey is a little bit later.
Absolutely. But Stewart came in town with his wife Gloria. They had a whole weekend of events, including a huge parade, dinner party, a breakfast at the fire hall. He did all sorts of things, meet and greet people, and this parade attracted tens of thousands of people. So this whole town was 10, 15 people deep on the parade. And then at the end of the parade, Jimmy Stewart got up to a podium on the courthouse steps and talked to the people. And they interrupted him and said, Mr. Stewart, we've got a phone call for you. So they handed him the phone, and then President Ronald Reagan was on the line, which was a good friend of Jimmy Stewart's. And he said, hey, Jim, I got a birthday present for you. And you look down the length of Philadelphia Street, and fighter jets flew down the length of the street in honor of Jimmy Stewart, which was great. In fact, it was known to have broken a few windows in some area businesses. But it was a great tribute to Stewart. He actually danced. We had retired teachers that volunteered as waitresses at the dinner dance, and he went and danced with each one of them because they were volunteering to work at it. He was such a humble and wonderful guy. We had cameras and news people from all over, so it was a really great event.
What an impressive tribute to him. But in the museum, we're also going to see some very unusual and some memorable items as well. For example, I believe you have something from a restaurant he frequented.
We do. We have his booth from the Chasen's restaurant, and which was a very famous restaurant in Beverly Hills, where all the stars, if you want to be seen, make a deal, that you were there. And there was only 5 people that had their own booth, and Jimmy Stewart was one of them. And we have his full, complete booth that was shipped to us on display. And the only other booth on display is Ronald Reagan's booth that is in his presidential library.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to go take a look.
Great.
And we're here inside the Jimmy Stewart Museum now with Janie. Janie, could you tell us a little bit about the history of the museum?
Well, there was a group of people that wanted to start this museum and went out to visit Jimmy. And originally Jimmy would said, who'd want to see a museum about me? Because he was actually that humble. But eventually he acquiesced on 2 conditions: that it be humble in size and that it be located in the heart of downtown, because he wanted it to economically benefit the town he loves so much.
Indiana, Pennsylvania.
Absolutely. And so we opened in 1995. Unfortunately, Jimmy Stewart was not able to see it. He did write a letter to us, and he sent his daughters for the grand opening, who have been back multiple times. He was pretty much, his wife had passed, and he was pretty much housebound at that point. But we've been around for 29 years now, and we have 6 galleries, a theater that shows matinees, and we've been thriving. So we attract about 6,000 people a year.
So the role of the museum in the community is large. and you're very much integrated into the community.
Absolutely. We bring in a lot of culture, we bring in rotating exhibits that people can see, and we bring a lot of money economically, which Jimmy Stewart wanted. He wanted to support his town. So people that come here also stay here and shop here and eat here. So it's the gift that keeps on giving, and we're grateful he greenlit the museum.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about his family?
Sure. His mom and his dad, they had 3 children. Jimmy was the oldest, and he had 2 younger sisters. And they loved it here. They lived on a little house up on 7th Street. And they would perform plays. His father was a volunteer firefighter besides running the hardware store, which was a huge iconic place in town. Everybody came here to buy things, to barter, to talk to Mr. Stewart. So Mr. Stewart or Alex kept the hardware store up in case that acting thing didn't work out with Jimmy, but obviously it did. And Jimmy even sent his Oscar back after he won it for Philadelphia Story, and Alex kept it in the front window of the hardware store till he passed away.
And Alex was one of the main motivators in his life, wasn't he?
Absolutely. Alex was it. Jimmy looked up to his father, and he felt like his family and this town taught him strong morals, a good work ethic, and a sense of community and family, which Jimmy Stewart attributes that. He always said that he had a great love and pride of being from Indiana, and he belonged here, and he was grateful for it.
Well, biographers of Jimmy Stewart's life have said that he was destined to fly. Could you tell us about his first plane flight?
Absolutely. He was a young boy who was fascinated with flying, and so barnstormers from time to time would come into our local airport, Grass Field, and Jimmy Stewart wanted a ride. And his parents said, well, you got to pay for it. So he saved up his allowance, because thinking he would never get the money. And he got enough money, and he went out there. His mom actually bought the town pediatrician, thinking he might hurt himself, and took his first flight. And after that, he was hooked on flying. And then when he was able and old enough, he took flying lessons and became a very, very talented pilot.
Mm-hmm. When he matured then, as education, where did he go to secondary school? Where did he go to college?
He started out actually at normal school, which is now IUP, Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Then he went on to Mercersburg Academy. And then from there, he wanted to join the Navy. And his dad said, no, you're going to Princeton, because Alex went to Princeton. So he went to Princeton, majored in architecture. Actually designed, his final senior project was designing an airport, which he won an award on that. So when he graduated from Princeton, the recession, or the Great Recession was going on, and nobody was building anything. So he didn't really have a job. So that's when he joined up with a little acting crew that went up to New York, and he originally just started playing accordion and doing bit parts, and eventually he got bigger parts, and that's where he was discovered.
Tell us how he got the accordion.
Oh, that was a barter at the hardware store. Somebody came in, didn't have the money, so they traded the accordion in for items they wanted at the hardware store. And initially the accordion went to Jimmy's sister, but it was too big for her to finagle. So then it went to Jimmy, and Jimmy taught himself how to play.
And you find then that he's becomes very interested in acting, and he finds he's good at it at Princeton, doesn't he?
Absolutely. He did a lot of plays and things. He was a cheerleader as well at Princeton, but he did a lot of plays and troops at Princeton. And then when he went up with his buddies from Princeton, they started doing things in New York, a traveling troupe. So he was very successful.
Eventually he moves to New York, doesn't he?
He does, okay. And he rooms with Henry Fonda. And they become best of friends. And what I love about this story is Henry Fonda was a far-left, agnostic Democrat, and Jimmy Stewart was a far-right religious Republican, yet they were best friends. Mm-hmm. And they didn't let those differences come between them.
Well, Jimmy Stewart was also a military hero of epic proportions that's not known to many people in the nation. How does his military career start? And is there a record of military service in his family?
Yes, actually military service goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and it was a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And every major Stewart man in his family served in the war. His dad served in the Spanish-American War and World War I. So Jimmy Stewart, before war broke out in World War II, was a really good pilot. He took flying lessons out in Hollywood. He had his personal airplane, which is a Cessna 310, that he would fly home and visit his family. In fact, we have that personal airplane that's been refurbished on display at our local Jimmy Stewart Airport as well. So he was a good pilot. And then Pearl Harbor broke out, and he felt the need to serve, and he was drafted. And he actually failed the physical for being too thin. So Jimmy Stewart, he could have had a get out of jail free card. He could have said, okay, I'm out, I don't have to serve. But he felt like it was his duty to serve his country. And so he went and ate a bunch of food and drank a bunch of milkshakes and tried to gain weight. But he also got a doctor's note where the doctor said, you're healthy, he's just built lean and lanky, and he's good to go. And he enlisted then and went into the Army Air Corps, which is the Air Force today. They kept him stateside most of the time because they didn't want this big Hollywood star who just won an Oscar for Philadelphia Story to be killed. That would be a big win for Germany, and it would be a huge morale hit for all the men serving. So they kept him over here. He did recruiting films. He trained pilots. But eventually, Stewart just kept saying, I want to see action. I want to do my share.
And tell the story of how he actually arranged them to go to Europe and fly.
Well, he actually went and he kept bugging them. And eventually the powers that be realized we need good pilots. And Stewart was an excellent pilot, one of the best ones. So they eventually acquiesced and sent him over to England where he was stationed. And he flew 20 dangerous combat missions over Germany. He usually volunteered for some of the tougher ones. He was very well respected. The paparazzi were mad because he didn't want to glamorize his service. He didn't want pictures. We have very few pictures of him serving because he wanted to be one of the men. And there's a great quote. He just said, we all look the same with our helmets on. So he was very dedicated serving, and then when he came out, he actually joined the reserves. So he came out as a colonel, and then he joined the reserves, and he retired then as a brigadier general, one of the highest ranking Hollywood actors.
So he continues in the Air Force,
Yes.
Air Force Reserves, all the way until 1960. 68?
I don't know that
Okay.
off the
I
top
think
of my head.
it's 68, and
Okay.
he retires as Brigadier General, but he flew over Vietnam and participated in that
He
conflict
did.
as well.
He actually went over there to boost troop morales and visit troops. And he actually said, I'd love to go on a bombing mission. I'd like to see how things have changed since I was in World War I or World War II. So he went on a plane and they did the bombing mission. Everything went well. He went as a guest. And when they were coming home, all of a sudden they're getting warning lights that the flaps and slats weren't going down. So they started putting parachutes on everybody, thinking, oh, great, we're going to hurt Jimmy Stewart. And eventually they realized that the warning lights were in error. They looked out the window and they were actually down, so they were able to land safely.
Okay, let's look next at another part of his life.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, the largest, most influential municipal association in the Commonwealth. Since 1921, PSATS has been preserving and strengthening township government and securing greater visibility and involvement for townships in the state and federal political arenas. Covering 95% of Pennsylvania's land mass, townships represent 5.5 million residents, more than any other type of political subdivision in Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Well, Janie, we were just talking about Jimmy Stewart's military record. He was actually highly decorated, wasn't he?
He absolutely was. He was actually the most decorated Hollywood star that was serving in World War II. So he got the French's Croix de Guerre medal. He won 2 air medals with Palm, and he won the Distinguished Flying Cross, and eventually he got the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan. So he was very highly decorated, amongst other things. So he was highly decorated in the military and in Hollywood.
And in Hollywood, what are some of the awards that he won for his career in the movies?
He won the Cecil B. DeMille Award in the Golden Globes. He won the American Film Institute Award. He was nominated for 5 Oscars, and he won 2. He won his first for The Philadelphia Story. And fun fact, Philadelphia is actually spelled wrong on his Oscar. And then he won one for Lifetime Achievement as well. But you look at some of the people he was up against for his other Oscar nominees, and you're looking Clark Gable and Peter O'Toole, and just some amazing Henry Fonda, and so he had a lot of competition there. In fact, for Philadelphia Story, he didn't think he was going to win, because his good friend Henry Fonda was up for Grapes of Wrath. So he wasn't even planning on going to the Oscars. And eventually they called him, because they knew in advance who the winners were, and said, you better put on a tux and show up down at the theater. And he voted for Henry Fonda, but he won eventually. So yeah, there was a lot of competition out there.
I understand that his good friend Henry Fonda wasn't all that happy that he lost that particular race.
He was not, because that's true. If you truly admit it, that was a role of a lifetime. And a lot of people say that Oscar for Philadelphia Story was almost also to reward him for the movie last year, which was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. People thought Jimmy Stewart should have won the year before because he was so amazing in that film.
But in the Philadelphia Story, it's hard not to be an award-winning actor when you're acting with Katharine Hepburn, right?
Oh, absolutely. And Cary Grant, it's the dream team.
Yeah. So let's take a look at Jimmy's movies and some of his roles. What would you consider to be his leading movies, the movies that stand out in cinema history?
Well, obviously, you've got to say It's a Wonderful Life first, because it's an amazing film. It's an iconic holiday classic. It's a movie that a lot of people think it's in one of the top 5 movies ever made.
And Frank Capra's the director.
Frank Capra's the director. And Steven Spielberg watches 3 films before he does a new film. And one of them is It's a Wonderful Life, because he thinks it's such a brilliant piece of cinematic work. So you have to say that first. But outside of that, I would say Harvey. I love Harvey. I think Stewart is brilliant in that. There's an invisible rabbit, and it could have been comical or farcical, but he plays it so well that you really believe that there's this invisible rabbit that he sees. He played it in the movies and on TV and on Broadway because he kept wanting to fine-tune Elwood P. Dowd, because he loved that role. So some would say, besides George Bailey, that was his favorite role. But boy, he did so many different genres. He did first romantic comedies, he did suspense, he did 4 movies with Hitchcock, he did a lot of biographies like Glenn Miller's Story, and then he did a ton of Westerns and a couple of other things dabbled in between. So he was over decades of work and really kind of evolved his acting through the years.
To do Westerns, he had to be a decent writer.
Absolutely, and he had a favorite horse named Pie that he rode in most of his Westerns, and he requested this horse, and he felt like he was in sync with this horse. When he wouldn't even have to tell it what to do, it would know to go right or go left. And so he loved that horse. In fact, he loved it so much that Henry Fonda, who was an amateur painter, actually quite good, painted a portrait of Pie to give to Jimmy Stewart as a gift, and he had it hanging on his wall.
Could you name a few of the other movies that you think that stand out in cinema history?
Absolutely. I would obviously say It's a Wonder, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I think that is a classic film and that people still talk about today because of the filibuster.
And again, Capra was the director.
Capra was the director. Yeah. Obviously, Philadelphia Story that we mentioned. He did 4 films with Hitchcock, and I think they're all worth noting.
What are they?
They are The Man Who Knew Too Much, Rope, Vertigo, and Rear Window. So all of those, and mostly, especially Rear Window and Vertigo, are classic films of Hitchcock. Hitchcock loved to take the everyday man and put him in a perilous situation, and Jimmy Stewart was the iconic everyday man. I would say Glenn Miller's Story. That's an amazing, he didn't want to, when he came back from the war, to glorify war in movies, so he kind of refused to do war movies, except for Glenn Miller, which was more about the music.
But it was interesting, he had seen Glenn Miller as a serviceman, and then he ends up playing him in
yes.
movies.
And in fact, he actually has Glenn Miller's trombone, because Glenn Miller died in a plane crash, but he did not have his trombone with him when he tragically died. So Jimmy Stewart actually used that. He wasn't actually playing. He did get a lot of lessons from people on how to do it and how to fake it well. But it's a really beautiful film with June Allison as well, who played his wife in 3 films. And then I would mention Anatomy of a Murder, that he was nominated for Academy Award, is a brilliant piece of work. And then he did a lot of Westerns. So I would say The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and Shenandoah are classic. I'm trying to think of Winchester 73 and The Rare Breed. So he did a lot of films. My favorite in that is probably The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. He did 2 with John Wayne, but that is just a classic film with a great end surprise ending.
How did he get along with John Wayne?
He got along with John Wayne pretty well. There was some competition there, but I think he's actually related to John Wayne by marriage. So we have a family tree that enables. But he was in John Wayne's last film, The Shootist, when Jimmy Stewart accepted a very small role just to be in that film because John Wayne at the time did have cancer, and people were knowing that that might be his last film.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here in the museum you have an interesting display of some of Jimmy Stewart's Western garb from Winchester 73.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that and about his role in that movie?
Absolutely. We have his full costume, including his favorite hat. And you can see there's sweat stains all over it. It was a well-loved hat. And he wore it in about 7 Western films. And the director, Tom Ford, actually said, oh, great, now I have an actor who wants hat approval. So he loved that hat. So we have that, and we actually have the Winchester 73 rifle that he used in the film. But fun fact about that movie, Jimmy Stewart, they approached him to do the film, and they said, we can't afford you. So he went back to his agent and said, how about we try and get a cut of the film, the proceeds? That had never been done before. So they reapproached the producers and said, okay, we won't take a salary, we'll take a cut of the film. And they're thinking, oh, that's great. And he ended up making double what he originally asked for. And after that, actors and their agents lined up to get that deal and get a cut of the proceeds. So he was the first person to do that.
Now, when he comes back from World War II, he was playing certain types of roles, and he had sort of a certain mindset. After the Second World War, he's a different person, isn't he? And how did that affect the roles that he accepted and the type of preparation and treatment that he rendered in those particular movies?
Absolutely. He went, his last film was Philadelphia Story right before he went in the war, which was a lighthearted comedy. But, he saw a lot of tragedy in the war, like everybody does. So he came back really having the weight of the war and what he saw over there. And the first film was It's a Wonderful Life. And Frank Capra actually served in the war as well. It said, and Lionel Barrymore actually talked Jimmy into doing it. He didn't think he still had the chops anymore, and whether he'd even have his Hollywood career anymore. But he did it, and when you see that bridge scene, when he's thinking about suicide and all that angst, is a lot of that war trauma coming out. It's very palpable. That scene is just incredible. And Jimmy Stewart could only do it once. He said, that's all I got in me. Breaks into tears, which was not in the script. And so he did that, and Frank Capra had to use a zoom in, which is a little grainy, because he couldn't do it again. Stewart had it up. But he also felt it was very cathartic and healing. And both he and Capra felt like it was the best movie they ever made, and it was the perfect film to do post-war because it got all of that angst out and realized that life is worth living and it's valuable, and every man who has friends is not a failure. No man who has friends is not a failure. And so it was a great lead-in. But he was not as lighthearted and jovial anymore. It was more, he was grittier and tougher, and hence he could play roles like Hitchcock roles, and that's when he went into Westerns. And Westerns, you had the Roy Rogers Westerns, but they got a lot of grittier along the way, and it was kind of when Jimmy Stewart entered in and a lot of other people. And so he had that grittier role and that darker side and that tougher side. And so a lot of his Westerns are really not the typical Stewart role that you're used to seeing him in, but it just shows his range as an actor.
Well, that's typical Stewart role. And going back to It's a Wonderful Life, a lot of people wonder what kind of relationship that he had with Donna Reed then for the rest of his career. Did he ever act with her again?
He never acted with her again, and I think there was some fallout for the film because it was not successful. And a lot of the reasoning they say behind that was it's post-war, people are war weary, they're tired, they don't want to watch. The movie's pretty dark until the very end, if you think about it, and they weren't in the mood or the mindset to see that film. It was nominated for a bunch of Academy Awards, but it just didn't do well until the royalties or the license ran out and NBC threw it on TV round the clock, and then it became the Hollywood classic it is today.
So it wasn't successful financially immediately,
no.
But in the long term, it's one of the most successful films of all
right,
time.
So it took a while, and I think there was a lot of fallout and just like, wow, I can't believe this didn't work. And Donna Reed was a brand new actress, and they thought maybe we should have gotten a bigger name. But you can't think of anybody better to play that role, and their chemistry. It was a beautiful film, and I think in hindsight, they realized what magic they made on the set.
Did Jimmy Stewart have any second doubts, any second guesses about his career in Hollywood, things that he wished that he would have done and wasn't able to do?
I don't know. I think there's obviously roles you miss out on and things like that, but I think he was really proud of the work he did. I think he has a really wide range of movies. At the tail end of his career, they're more lighthearted. He goes back to comedies again, because at that time, movies got increasingly violent. They got a little sexual, there was swearing in it, and Jimmy Stewart didn't want a part of that. So he kind of decided to do the lighthearted comedies, because the other ones he just didn't want to accept. So it kind of changed his roles near the end as well.
Maybe some of the roles that he had earlier on, such as the one that he had in as Jefferson Smith in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, led to, after the war, he was invited by the Democratic Party of Pennsylvania to run for governor.
He was.
And what happened with that? Will you tell us that story?
He had no desire to do that at all. In fact, he said he doesn't speak fast enough to be a politician. So they did approach him and try to get him to run, but he did. And he was a Republican as well, so that kind of played into it.
Yeah, I think you have a letter here, don't you, that he actually writes in response to this, and he says, one of the reasons I can't accept, although it's very flattering, is I am a Republican.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, but he did a lot of really interesting movies along the timeline. If I bring up Broken Arrow, that was the first film that portrayed Native Americans in a sympathetic light. Before that time, they were savages and scalpers and terrible, terrible people. And that film took from the standpoint of the Native Americans. It was sympathetic to their plight. And Stewart actually won an award and was named an honorary Indian because of his role and what he did with this film. And so it was really paved the way for films like Little Big Man and Dances with Wolves and other films that came on after that.
In the museum, what if you, in the last minute that we have in the museum, which are the leading exhibits in your mind in the Hollywood section? What are you most proud of?
Oh, wow. Probably proud of, I love our little Harvey corner. We play big homage to Harvey because it's such a great film and he did it in so many different genres. But I guess he did so many Westerns that instead of doing it in chronological order, we grouped things like Hitchcock, and we have a whole Western gallery that's got his director's chair and guns and his uniforms and his awards. There was so much to do that it was really fun to have a thematic theme for one of our hallways in all the Westerns.
Did Jimmy ever play the accordion in any movie that he was in?
He did, and some of the Westerns, I don't remember offhand which ones they were, but he was sitting around the fire and he was playing the accordion, so absolutely.
Amazing. And Janie, in the museum, do you show any of his famous films?
Absolutely. We have a 50-seat theater, vintage theater, that just got redone. And we have surround sound speakers and all sorts of a brand new screen, a brand new digital projector, laser. And so it's a beautiful theater to come in and watch either a biography or a matinee of Jimmy Stewart.
Okay, well, Janie, we want to thank you for being on Behind the Headlines. And we want to invite all of you to come back next week for another episode of Behind the Headlines. We'll see you then.